December 1944. The Ardennes forest. Snow falls on pine trees. It falls on the frozen mud of a foxhole. In the distance, an explosion breathes a soft orange light across the landscape. The air smells of damp wool and fear. For the men of the Wehrmacht, this is the last great gamble, a desperate lunge through the American lines. This is not just a story of men and machines. It is a story of the invisible nervous system of the war. The signals, the codes, the voices in the static. Before we follow the whispers on the airwaves, take a moment to subscribe and tell us where you are watching from in the comments below. We love seeing how far these stories travel. For 22-year-old Ingrid Bauer, a signals auxiliary, the war had become this, the biting cold, the gnawing hunger, and the fragile messages she pulled from the ether. Her fingers, wrapped in threadbare gloves, deftly turned the knobs on a bulky German field radio. Her world was a universe of frequencies, a battle fought not with bullets, but with wavelengths. She was good, one of the best. The high command called women like her lightning girls, the unseen gears in the great machine. But now, in the frozen hell of the bulge, the machine was breaking down. The whispers she heard were no longer of victory, they were of desperation. The German communication network was held together with will and ingenuity. Ingrid's radio was a marvel of 1930s engineering. It was also heavy, temperamental, and powered by a hand-cranked generator. Every message was a physical struggle. Every transmission was a beacon, screaming their position to American artillery. They moved constantly. Dig, set up, transmit, pack up, and run. For days, food had been a rumor. A half-frozen potato, a piece of stale bread shared between 4 people. Hunger was a dull ache in her stomach, a fog in her mind. She had joined the war effort with patriotic fervor, believing in the defense of the homeland. Now, she was defending a patch of mud for a cause that felt increasingly hollow. The message she just passed to the lieutenant was grim. Panzers halted. No fuel. Awaiting. The message cut out. It did not need finishing. They were awaiting the end. And then, the end arrived. It was not the heroic climax promised by the propaganda posters. It was the terrifying shriek of American 105mm shells. The world dissolved into explosions, splintering wood and human screams. The last thing Ingrid remembered was the radio being thrown against the wall of the foxhole, its delicate vacuum tubes shattering with a faint pop. Then, silence. When consciousness returned, it was to the sight of an enemy she had only seen in caricatures, the gray sky above, the silhouette of an American M1 helmet. A face leaned over her, young, clean-shaven chewing gum. He was a boy, maybe younger than her, with a rifle pointed casually at her chest. "Hande hoch," he said. His German was clumsy. Hands up. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach. She thought of the stories she had been told, what the Americans did to capture German women. The propaganda had been very specific. But the GIs were efficient, professional. They searched them for weapons, then offered them cigarettes. This was the first paradox. The enemy, who had just tried to kill her, now offered a simple, human comfort. She took one, her hand trembling. The taste of the American tobacco, rich and sweet, was a shocking pleasure after years of harsh German cigarettes. Her specialized role made her a person of interest. As a radio operator, she knew codes and frequencies. She was separated from the male soldiers and led towards a jeep. She was taken to a makeshift command post, a captured Belgian farmhouse. As she approached the door, a smell hit her like a physical blow, a smell from a world she had forgotten existed. It was the smell of brewing coffee and frying bacon. Her mind reeled. The propaganda had promised cruelty and death. It never mentioned this. What kind of enemy was this? What did they want from her? The fear in her stomach twisted into a new shape. A deep, unsettling suspicion. Inside the farmhouse, the warmth was a shock. The air was thick with the scent of coffee, fried meat, and something else. Something clean. An American captain, a man whose face was etched with a deep weariness, sat at a wooden table. He looked at her, not with malice, but with a kind of professional curiosity. An interpreter, a young private with nervous eyes, stood beside him. The captain spoke in English, his voice low and calm. He did not ask for troop positions. He did not ask for plans. He asked about her radio. What model? What was its effective range? Was she using Enigma for tactical communications? Ingrid, her mind a whirlwind of fear and training, gave short, clipped answers. Resist. Reveal nothing. But a part of her, the technician, the professional, was disarmed. This man was not a brute demanding secrets. He was a fellow signals officer. He was talking shop. He saw her not as a woman, not as a Nazi, but as a skilled opponent. This was a new kind of weapon, one her training had never prepared her for. The enemy's mercy was confusing. Their professional respect was devastating. Then he showed her. He led her into what had been the farmhouse parlor. It was now the nerve center of an American signals company. And for Ingrid, it was like stepping into another century. Her world had been one of bulky, sensitive machines that demanded constant, frantic labor. Here, stacked on tables, were radios that seemed impossibly small, impossibly clean. There was no hand-cranked generator grinding in the corner, just the quiet, confident hum of electricity. She saw the famous SCR 300, the walkie-talkie, a radio a single man could carry on his back. Her own unit's equivalent weighed over 70 pounds and took 2 men to operate. The captain picked up a small metal box, a BC 611, a radio the size of a telephone handset. He spoke into it. A clear voice answered from across the room. It was witchcraft. It was a level of technology so advanced it felt like a dream. He motioned for her to listen to a headset connected to a bank of receivers. She put it on. There was no static. No fading. Just a calm, clear American voice directing an artillery strike miles away with terrifying efficiency. In that moment, Ingrid understood. They were not just losing a war of tanks and planes. They were losing a war of wavelengths. They were shouting into a hurricane while the Americans whispered on a private, crystal-clear line. The sheer industrial power behind this one room was more demoralizing than any artillery barrage. Her skill, her struggle, her sacrifice, it had all been for a cause that was, technologically, a museum piece. Her journey continued at a prisoner of war camp in the rear. It was not the brutal, starved existence promised by Goebbels. It was a place of surreal abundance. The first shock was the shower. Unlimited hot water. Soap that smelled of flowers. It washed away not just the grime of the front, but layers of her identity. Then came the food. A guard placed a tray before her. White bread, a slab of meat, and a small jar of a strange brown paste. He saw her confusion and mimed spreading it on the bread. Peanut butter. She tasted it. The rich, salty, sweet flavor was a caloric explosion she had not known in years. Red Cross reports would later confirm an American K ration contained over 2,800 calories. Her own ration, on a good day, had been less than a third of that. They were given Coca-Cola, a mythical elixir whose sharp fizz and overwhelming sweetness was another piece of evidence from an impossible world. Her comrades were freezing to death in the Ardennes, fighting for an ideology of Spartan sacrifice. And here she was, a prisoner, experiencing luxuries unthinkable for a civilian in Berlin. If this story is already challenging what you thought you knew, take a moment to subscribe. The deepest ironies are yet to come. She watched the guards through the wire fence. They were boys, obsessed with a strange game called baseball. They listened to jazz music on the radio. They talked about movie stars. They were not the indoctrinated supermen of German propaganda. They were just people. People from a land of unimaginable plenty, fighting a war with a grim professionalism, but without the all-consuming hatred she had been taught was necessary for victory. The cruelty of her own leaders, who demanded everything and gave nothing, stood in stark contrast to the casual, almost careless mercy of the enemy. They did not seem to be trying to win her over. They just had so much of everything that sharing it was no great effort. She was a prisoner of war, but for the first time in years she felt safe. She was fed. She was warm. And a terrifying question began to form in her mind. Which side of the wire was the real prison? The re-education began subtly. It was not indoctrination in the way she understood it. There were no shouted slogans, no rallies. It began with moving pictures. In a large, heated tent, the prisoners were shown American newsreels. They saw cities in Germany, not as heroic strongholds, but as seas of rubble. They saw endless convoys of American ships crossing the Atlantic, a river of steel that could not be stopped. They were shown Hollywood films, stories of cowboys and gangsters, worlds so alien and confident they seemed to be broadcast from another planet. Some prisoners scoffed. Others watched in silence, the images planting seeds of doubt. Then, the lessons became more direct. They were taken to classrooms, taught by German-speaking American officers. On a blackboard, they were shown the numbers. The statistics of industrial production for the year 1944. The United States had built over 96,000 military aircraft. Germany, just under 40,000. The United States had launched ships whose total tonnage was counted in the millions. Germany's U-boat fleet was being sunk faster than it could be built. The numbers were cold, impersonal, and irrefutable. They were the mathematical formula for defeat. For Ingrid, who had seen the walkie-talkie and the crystal-clear receivers, these numbers were simply the explanation for the witchcraft she had already witnessed. The psychological pressure mounted. Letters from home, when they arrived, were thin and brittle. They spoke of dwindling rations and constant air raids, but were filled with forced, desperate optimism about final victory and secret weapons. The prisoners would read these letters, then walk to the mess tent and be served pork chops and applesauce. The contrast was a form of madness. The abundance was no longer a comfort. It was an accusation. It was a mirror reflecting the starvation of their own families. The breaking point came for many. A man who had been a university professor in civilian life was found hanging from the rafters of a barracks. Another tried to run for the wire, screaming that he would rather be shot by the enemy than fed by them. Despair was a quiet contagion. It moved through the camp like a fog. Ingrid felt it too. A profound weariness, a sense of being hollowed out. Everything she had believed, every sacrifice she had made, was being systematically proven to be not just wrong, but absurd. Her honor felt like a costume for a play that had ended. One evening, they were gathered in the movie tent again. There was no newsreel, no Hollywood story. The film that flickered to life was silent, grainy, and shot with a handheld camera. It showed piles of skeletal bodies being bulldozed into a pit. It showed emaciated survivors staring into the camera with eyes that held nothing. The officer explained in a calm, flat voice. This was Buchenwald. This was Bergen-Belsen. This was what they had been fighting for. This was the homeland they had been defending. A wave of nausea and revulsion swept through the tent. Some men vomited. Others wept openly. Ingrid felt a cold certainty settle in her soul. This was not propaganda. Propaganda was loud, colorful, and heroic. This was the quiet, obscene truth. The captain from the farmhouse sent for her a few days later. She was no longer a prisoner to be interrogated. She was a problem to be solved. He did not show her pictures or quote statistics. He simply looked at her, his weary eyes holding a flicker of something she could not name. Pity, perhaps. He spoke in his slow, careful English. He told her about the German signals he was still intercepting, frantic messages from pockets of resistance, orders from a high command that no longer existed, directing phantom armies to attack non-existent targets. It was the sound of a nervous system twitching after the body had died. He slid a pair of headphones across the table, the same kind she had worn in the farmhouse. He did not give an order. He made a simple statement. We need to know what they are thinking, he said, not just what the messages say. We need to know their state of mind, their morale, their desperation. Only someone who has been on that frequency can hear the truth between the static. He was not asking her to betray soldiers. He was asking her to translate the sound of despair, to help end the dying. Ingrid looked at the headphones. They were a link to her old world, a world of lies and hunger and pointless sacrifice. But they were also her craft, her skill, the one part of her old identity that was still real. To put them on would be the final surrender. To refuse would be to cling to an honor that had been built on a foundation of ash and bone. She reached out a hand, her fingers trembling slightly, and took them. The headphones felt heavy in her hands, a familiar weight, a link to a life that was now an artifact. She slipped them over her ears. The static was the same, but the voices were different, thinner, frayed. She heard a young lieutenant, his voice cracking with panic, reporting an attack by an American tank that was not there. She heard a quartermaster begging for rations from a depot that had been overrun 3 days ago. These were not soldiers. They were ghosts, broadcasting their own eulogies. Ingrid did not translate the words. She translated the terror. She explained the pauses, the frantic speed of the Morse code, the way an operator's hand trembled on the key. She mapped the nervous system of a dying army. It was not betrayal. It was an autopsy. When the war ended, it was not with a bang, but with a memo. The barbed wire came down. The guards put away their rifles. Ingrid Bauer was given a set of civilian clothes and repatriation papers. She was no longer a prisoner of war. She was just a German woman, one of millions, returning to a country that was now a ruin. As she boarded a train bound for Berlin, she passed a line of American soldiers receiving their rations. One of them was unwrapping a bar of Hershey's chocolate. The smell, sweet and impossibly rich, drifted towards her. It was the smell of victory, not of triumph, but of a world so full it could afford to be sweet. Berlin was a city of skeletons. Buildings were hollowed-out husks. The people were gray, their faces etched with a hunger she now recognized as her own past. She had returned home, but home was a foreign country. She tried to tell her family about her experience, about the radios that fit in your hand, about the unlimited hot water, about the strange, sweet paste made from peanuts. They stared at her with incomprehension. These were not stories of war. They were fairy tales, fantasies from a world that could not possibly exist. Her experience, the very thing that had saved her, now isolated her. She learned to be silent. Her war was a secret she kept locked away, a memory of a golden cage. Years later, an old woman, she would reflect on the moment her war truly ended. It was not in the Ardennes, under the screaming shells. It was not in the interrogation room, answering the captain's questions. It was in that first moment of capture, when an enemy soldier, his face barely old enough to shave, offered her a cigarette. The war had taught her to expect cruelty, hatred, and a glorious death. The propaganda had prepared her for anything except a simple human gesture. The greatest shock was not the enemy's power to kill. It was their power to be casual, to be generous, to be merciful. This was a weapon for which she had no defense. It was the weapon that had conquered her completely. She had been trained to fight an army of monsters, but she was defeated by an army of boys who chewed gum and listened to jazz. And the question that haunted her for the rest of her life was not whether her country had lost the war, but whether it had ever been fighting the same one. If this story challenged what you thought you knew about victory and defeat, please like this video and subscribe for more hidden histories. What was the most shocking detail for you? The technology, the food, or the unexpected mercy? Let us know in the comments below.